who is Jane Gatley?
So I'm a philosopher of education based in an education department at Swansea University. Well, my PhD was on why we should teach philosophy in schools, which is what you want to talk to me about. And then since then, the sort of strands that have come up from that work have been things that I've continued to be interested in. So, like what the value of philosophy is, that question keeps coming up for me. What the curriculum should look like, that question keeps coming up for me. So those are the sorts of things I'm interested in my work now. And I've just come back off maternity leave, so I'm just getting back into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations on that. You
Oh,
mentioned
and
earlier that you had a baby back in August, and
yeah.
that's exciting. Yeah, I'd love to know more about like how you got here. So, when did you decide to become a philosopher of education?
So I guess I feel very lucky to be a philosopher of education. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy my work, and it wasn't something that I always knew I wanted to do or that I jumped into immediately. So when I did a philosophy degree at university, I think at the time I was I was 18. I wanted something that wouldn't bore me, and I'm sure lots of things wouldn't have bored me, but I just felt really excited by philosophy, so I did a degree, and I loved it. Um, and then I went on to do a master's, and that I loved less. There was a lot of infighting in my department, and it felt it's just a bit of a letdown after the undergraduate, where all ideas were on the table and we're excited about everything. And then you see people bickering over, I don't know, over how to use language and things like that, and it put me off a bit. And then because of that, I went into teaching. So I thought, well, actually, I can teach religious education in the United Kingdom. That's what I could get funding to teach with a philosophy degree. And there was I did a little placement, and there was a lot of scope for children learning philosophy, and that spark of philosophy that I really enjoyed at university, where you know everything's on the table, you get to discuss everything. Yeah, and then I trained as a religious education teacher, and I taught for 7 years. And after 7 years, I finally clicked that like I really wanted to go and back to university, and I wanted to do a PhD, and I had an idea for it, and it got funding. And then I've been very fortunate to be able to continue that work and to get a position at Swansea.
Yeah, well, that's exciting. Well, let's talk a little bit about why is it important to have philosophy in the schools, and why is it important to have a justification for having philosophy in the schools?
Okay. Well, I can go from two different directions. So the first is just my intuition that pushed me to start to do the research, and I was teaching philosophy in schools as a religious education teacher. It's a funny subject, religious education. Um, what you have to teach is 6 different religions with a focus on Christianity in British schools. That's what you're employed to do. And what happens in practice is that religious education teachers come from all sorts of different backgrounds, and a lot of us have philosophy degrees. And there's lots of scope, or there used to be lots of scope, for asking philosophical questions. And obviously, that's what I loved. So that's what I did. So I'd be asking all these philosophical questions, loosely tied. You know, some of the answers would be like, okay, well, what does this religion say about it? What does that religion say about it? What questions does this bring up? How can we analyze the answers to that? And there were quite a lot of us doing that. And there was also scope in how the students were being examined. So they could sit an ethics, religion and ethics paper, or a religion and philosophy paper. So it was kind of recognised. And when I was doing it, it was that what I was telling you about. I could see children really enjoying it. I could see them light up. I could see them bringing those questions to their other classrooms. I could see them telling me that they'd spoken about it at home. I could see them bringing what they did in a science lesson into my class and wanting to discuss it in relation to what we were talking about. Like, I found it really exciting. Not all the time. Obviously, some of the time students didn't engage, and it was difficult. And it was a difficult job. Teaching is a difficult job. But there was quite a lot that I thought was really great that was happening. That was because I was doing philosophy in the school with them. And then in around 2016, the government started to change things, and they sort of unwittingly wrote out philosophy from this subject. And I think they did it because they didn't know it was there. They also did it. I think if they had known it was there, they may also have done it, because the attitude was that if it's not knowledge, if you can't write it down, if it's not sort of quantifiable set of stuff to learn and to spew out again that it wasn't really worth much, and that kind of was reflected in a lot of what was happening in schools at the time. Um, but yeah, so it was getting written out, and that was the point where I thought, well, actually, I want to argue that this should be here because it is here. It has been here. It's not been here formally, but it has been here because people like me have been passionate about putting it here, and it's been doing a lot of good, and it's going. And I just didn't have the language to be able to make the case for that. I didn't know where to start. Um, and when I looked at what had been written, it was about philosophy for children, and that I wasn't doing philosophy for children really. I was teaching philosophy in a way almost as it would be at university, but adapted for a classroom. In the way that, you know, if you teach maths, you teach what would be taught at university, but adapted for a classroom. I suppose it was more content heavy than a lot of the arguments I was reading about before. So that those arguments weren't really helping me. And I didn't know what it was that was happening, and I wanted to figure it out. So that's the personal side of it. Yeah.
Sometimes people will defend a practice that already exists. And it's this idea that there's this thing that is beautiful and it's important and it's valuable and it's under threat and we need to defend it against these threats. And other times what happens is that people are arguing for a new possibility. They're like, it would be really cool if we could change our language in this way or institute this new practice or ameliorate this problem. And it sounds to me like what's motivating you is the former. You're trying to defend this beautiful practice of philosophy against threats. Is that a fair statement?
That would be the motivation. Um,
Yeah.
I think in practice, what I was looking for was an argument for the latter, though, because if I
Okay.
just argue the former, um, it's less of a case. If you just say, well, here's something good that's already happening, here's all the things that are good about it, that's okay.
Yeah.
But there are so many contexts where philosophy is not taught in schools. And
Hmm.
what I wanted was an argument for why it should be brought in, even when it's not there, for why a space should be
Okay.
made for it, even when there's no space for it, for why it's something that's essential to what education is, rather than just something
Okay.
good that's already happening. Yeah. But the motivation was
Got it.
definitely something precious to me that I wanted to argue for.
Okay, got it. So it's like something that you value
Mm.
is under attack. That motivates you to fight for it. But then this next step is we can't just fight for things that have we can't just defend the manifestations that have already existed. We need to expand it because philosophy has been absent in so many places throughout the school system.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
the other thing is that the way I was teaching it as part of religious education is completely not ideal. It doesn't really fit in
yeah.
there. I always felt like I was sneaking it in. I didn't really have proper
Mm.
recognition, and it was always a bit of a compromise. Yeah.
Okay, got it. No, that's really helpful. So you mentioned that the defenses of P for C didn't give you everything you needed, and there's a couple reasons for that. The main one that you focused on so far was that the approach that you're using isn't really a P for C approach. It's more of a traditional philosophy education approach, like we see in universities, just adapted so that it can be done in classrooms with younger people. I'm wondering if you could talk us through some reasons why the existing attempts to defend philosophy in schools have failed. I found this to be a really fascinating part of your book, and I think our listeners are going to be particularly interested in hearing about why P for C defenses have failed in your view, because this is primarily going to be a P for C audience.
So I don't think people see uh, defenses fail outright. I think they
Okay.
fail to achieve what I wanted to achieve in the book. So
Okay.
people see defenses are absolutely fine and very useful for people who are who want to say what's good about what they're doing. I mean, I see
Mm.
them more as reasons for doing philosophy than an argument for teaching philosophy in schools. Um,
Okay.
so they're mainly reasons why people see as good, and some of them backed up with evidence, some of them backed up with theoretical work. And I wouldn't want to say that they're wrong. They're not wrong. People see is good, and these reasons, and
Mhm.
people are putting forward very good reasons why it's good. But to give a reason why something is good is not the same as giving a reason why it should be given a place on a school curriculum which is short on time. So in the book, the starting point is this question that R.S. Peters, who was a philosopher of education in the 1960s in the UK, starts with or asks, and he says, if you want to justify something's place on the curriculum, you should ask, why do this rather than that? Why should we teach history rather than teach chess? And you have to have a very strong reason for saying, well, actually, this is a good use of children's time, and that's not. This is and children's time and the curriculum are something that we should take very seriously. That they are not usually, well, going to school is not always consensual. It's compulsory for a child that when they're sent to school. They can argue against it. They can maybe take a day off. They can maybe change their institution. But if their parents want them to go to school, and if the state wants them to go to school, very often they are coerced into going to school. And a big chunk of their childhood is used up by what we say they should be taught. And so I think what P4C doesn't really do is it doesn't talk about why philosophy itself provides something tangible that really is educational, that's fundamental to education. It lists a lot of good things, but maybe the work isn't always done to say why this thing is fundamental to education. And when that is done, or where we can reasonably expect that seems to work, it often seems to be that the case being made is for something like the community of inquiry, rather than for other aspects of philosophy. Which again is fine if you're a P4C practitioner and you really believe in the community of inquiry and you think philosophy is a good way of bringing about the community of inquiry and you're giving reasons for why that's great, then that's absolutely fine to take that tack, to take that approach. But if you want to say we should teach philosophy in schools, well, then you're left with, well, why aren't you just doing the community of inquiry in some subject that's already there? Why introduce these philosophical questions? Why introduce the philosophical content? And I think a lot of the arguments or the reasons don't take that sort of question seriously.
Good. Yeah. So let's just work through that slowly so people can see exactly what the claims are. So one thing that you could be criticizing is the P4C defense's abilities to succeed on their own terms. If you look at the claims that are being made in defense of P4C, some of those claims just aren't supported by the data, and the studies that they offer in support of them aren't very high quality studies. And I think that you're making two additional points. Tell me if I'm mistaken about this. One point is that if you want to say that P4C does foster mathematics skills, improvements in mathematics skills, and let's just suppose that a study comes out, it shows that there are flaws in all the ones that found no difference, and there actually is a statistically significant difference with a noticeable effect size that we should care about. That wouldn't be enough to answer the why do this rather than that question. Because, well, if what you care about is math skills, why not have more math classes?
Yeah.
And then the other thing you're saying is that imagine that there's something that P4C uniquely does. Perhaps it uniquely fosters better moral and civic abilities. Why are you saying that should be included in schools? School is a coercive thing that is inflicted upon students. And we need to be really careful about what we're demanding students do when we take their time from them non-consensually and subject them to a form of education. And so, on the one hand, when we point to an academic skill where there's a clear justification for including it within schools, P4C hasn't said why they do it better than all the alternatives. And in cases where there is something that is uniquely pointed to by P4C, there isn't enough justification of why this needs to be included in schools, as opposed to some other domain of life. Is that a fair summary of the critique?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you for getting it so clearly.
And so this is a more radical critique than people might appreciate. I think that if somebody just says, I'm not convinced that P4C increases IQ points, and so we're not going to accept it for this reason, that would be similar to saying, I'm not convinced that history education makes people more empathetic or something like that. The critique you're doing more is to say that we haven't done a good job of justifying any subjects that are being taught in schools. And so if we're going to do this for philosophy, we got to do better than history. We got to do better than English. We got to do better than all of them, because we're fighting against the status quo, which has already accepted that all those things are going to be acceptable. So we need to do a better job than them. We got to hold ourselves to a higher standard if we're going to make it in. Is that true?
I wanted to present the best possible argument. I wanted, thinking about the teacher that I was teaching philosophy and it being taken off the curriculum and me having to do it kind of secretly anyway. I wanted to be able to have the language to go to my head teacher and say, look, this is really why it should be here. Absolutely, it should. There's, here's a really good reason why it should be there and why it's absolutely fundamental to everything you're trying to achieve. Similarly, to be able to go to policymakers and have the language to be able to make that case. Because not that there's much hope that they will listen and put it in there. I mean, maybe, but not to have that argument is to go in unarmed with something that you really need because of the position that philosophy is in.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to ask you about the criterion that you're using to justify inclusions on the curriculum. It sounds to me like what you're doing is saying that to get on the curriculum, something needs to say, like a subject needs to be able to make the case that it provides a benefit better than its alternatives. And there might be something that provides a lot of different benefits, but such that for any of those unique benefits, there's something else that provides it better. I'm thinking about the difference between taking I'm vegan, so I take vitamin B12 and vitamin D quite a lot. And it's really convenient when I can take a multivitamin and I can just take that and get B12 and D and do all of that. And I know that in some cases, I might make some trade-offs because maybe I get a little bit more vitamin D, or maybe it's a little bit pure vitamin B12 if I try to source each one individually. But it might be cheaper sometimes, more convenient, and it might give me enough of the benefit that I don't really notice much of a difference. Why not look for a multivitamin defense of P for C, where we're like, here's all these wonderful things it does, where we can support those wonderful things based on some educational theory, rather than trying to say, this defense fails because it doesn't answer the why do this rather than that question for each specific educational good considered in isolation.
So I don't think that sort of defense fails. I think that sort of defense works in many cases. I think it's quite a powerful defense. I find the analogy difficult to get my head around. So a multivitamin makes sense if your aim is to have all of the nutrients. But what's the analogous aim in education? To have all of what? So what's the multivitamin curing? It's I think how we use this children's time that is set aside for them to be in education really needs you to think about what education is and what it's for and what the aim is. And I think that's the difference. I think the multivitamin approach is works. You can just say, well, it just makes them generally better. But what is it to be generally more educated? What are you trying to achieve? And I think that question is lacking in a lot of the work on P4C.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So one thing that I think we're going to need to get clear on before we can really appreciate your account is what you mean by theoretical education. Could you tell me a little bit about what you mean by that term?
Okay, good. So I don't like the term theoretical education, but I spent a long time trying to label it something. And what I mean by theoretical education, what I'm referring to when I use that term, is the time we spend telling children stuff. And you can see why I had to give it a name, because you can't just say the time we spend telling children stuff. But a lot of school time is spent telling children stuff. I find that really interesting that we spend all of this time telling children stuff and no one talks about that, or no one talks about why we do that. So, we've been talking about all these good things that different interventions can bring about. We don't really have people saying, well, we tell children stuff because it makes them like more sociable or better at critical thinking. It, People don't give any justification of why we tell children stuff. So one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I'm still really interested in it, I think it's still unresolved, is theoretical education. This telling children of stuff that we have historically always done and keep doing and don't really question.
I think that if I were to just go into a room full of philosophers of education and say, um, I'm defending telling children stuff, they might think I'm talking about like Paulo Freire's like banking model of education, and I don't think you're doing that.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if you could tell me why. Yeah.
I think when you so I go through quite a lot of in the book different ways that this is sort of vaguely justified, and the one that I find most compelling is not really something that's written as an explicit justification of doing this, but something that people talk about when they talk about it, and they talk about how when you're told something, it transforms you in some way, that you start to see the world differently. And for me as a teacher, that rang true. When I, for example, tell the story of Siddhartha Gautama going out of the palace and seeing a sick person, an old person, a dead person, and um, a religious person, you are telling someone something and you are hoping that it's going to have some sort of impact on them, that when they leave that classroom, they're going to see the world slightly differently because they were introduced to this new idea about it that hopefully will ring true in some way or another. I think this is even true for dry scientific facts. The one I use is photosynthesis. If you're taught a theory of photosynthesis, about how plants create energy from light, you look at plants differently. They're not just random green things, they're green for a reason. And not only do you look at them differently, but you know a bit more about how to interact with them, what to do with them. So if I have a plant that's turned yellow because it's in the corner of my room with no light, I can think, oh, you know what, that plant would pretty benefit from being in the sun now that I know what the sun is doing to that plant. And so you start to work your way in the world more effectively because you understand it more. So I think that to me is quite it's intuitive to me as a teacher that when I was telling someone something, I wanted them to absorb it and to think about the world differently based on what I told them. And I think if we think about why we tell people things, just in general, why you tell your friend an interesting story, um, why you tell someone where their lunchbox is, it's because you want them to do something with that, even if that something is very ephemeral, like look at the world slightly differently. And so I think that seems to capture something of the value of why we bother telling people stuff, which we do a lot of.
Yeah. So you tell people stuff in education, and ideally it's transforming them.
Mm.
It's turning them into somebody who can see the world differently, somebody who can have a richer picture of the world. I'm just finding myself really curious. Imagine if somebody comes to you and says, uh, "Oh yeah, this is great. I see my students as passive receptacles of information. The way it works is I have the content. They're going to sit here and listen, and I'm going to put it from my head into their heads, and then that's going to transform how they see the world."
I think what's interesting is that my story means that they're not entirely wrong, right? They're not entirely wrong. There's sometimes that's going to work. There are some students who are just going to lap that up, and they're really going to go, oh, you look historically at people who've had that sort of education, and some of them that really lit them up, and they became great scholars, and they loved that. Um, and others of them they didn't. So I think what I would say to them is that's really an empirical question. The best way to do this is really an empirical question.
Just to be clear, you're not giving a moral objection against viewing students as the receptacles for information. What you're talking about is the practical technique of actually giving them this information. And so it's an empirical question whether standing up and dryly giving a lecture or engaging them in different types of activities is the most effective way of getting information from point A to point B. But that's the way that you're critiquing kind of this dry delivery. It's not in the sense of the dry delivery fails students because it fails to treat them like co-inquirers and instead treats them like receptacles of information that I have. Am I understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's something important that that I need to clarify
Yeah.
about the whole project. I don't argue for, and I'm not sure that a theoretical education should happen in schools, or should.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So at no point do I commit to that. So the starting point is that it does happen in schools. It happens an awful lot.
Okay.
Is there some value to it? I think there is. Is that
Hmm.
what education should be about? Probably to some extent, it should be at least a bit about that. I think I think having a decent base of stuff that you know is fundamental to a lot of other goals.
Hmm.
But should we be thinking about children flourishing more than we should be thinking about them being receptacles of theoretical education? Most probably, yes. It
Hmm.
might be that they, and I think it probably is the case that they do need to have a certain amount of theoretical content to be able to flourish. But probably the extent to which theoretical education dominates schooling is out of is excessive. So that's a question that I'm really interested in continuing with,
Yeah.
and I think some of the responses to the book have not picked up on that. So it wasn't
Okay.
clear enough about it. Um, that's why I said, you remember when we were talking about starting from the status quo. That's the status quo that I've started
Yeah.
from. This is what happens in schools
Okay.
across the world and has happened in schools historically. Um, what's trying to be achieved by that bit of education? And I do think that that bit of education has value, but I think probably if you think about what it is that we hope for children when they go through an education, it is not just a theoretical education. It's something um, either something more than that, that's in a singular thing like flourishing, or it's a plurality of things. Maybe we also
Hmm.
want them to be physically healthy, and maybe that's something
Yeah.
education should also be concerned with. I think the answer is probably going to be it's a plurality of things, and it's going to be about partitioning up the time to get a reasonable balance of all of these good things that education is about. But one of the things it is about is theoretical education, and it's within theoretical education that my arguments for philosophy come about. And then, given the fact that theoretical education is so dominant in schools, I think that gives us a fairly powerful argument for going to people and saying, look, this is what you're doing. Why are you doing that? It doesn't make sense if there's no
Hmm.
philosophy anyway, if that's what you're trying to achieve. And that's the argument.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. So what you're saying is that um, people value theoretical education, and it's in schools, and we can justify adding philosophy into the schools by thinking about why theoretical education is valuable and saying that a theoretical education in philosophy is valuable given that given what you think the best account is of the value of theoretical education.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so somebody else could come back and say, okay, great. Theoretical education should have 30% of the school day. The other two-thirds should be about social emotional learning and community building and all this other civic stuff. And P for C should do that. I'm not saying that you should endorse that view. I'm saying that somebody could read your book, accept what you say about theoretical education, and then go ahead and do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can say that, well,
Yeah.
theoretical education isn't all there is to education. There are these other things. Here's another argument for philosophy based on
Okay,
those other
cool. No,
things.
this is
Yeah.
really exciting. So this is one reason why I'm really glad we can talk about this because I think I missed that option in the space of ideas you were presenting in your book when I wrote my review of it, and this is really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, Let me ask you to just tell us like what do you think the best defense of theoretical education is?
And what I come up with is what I call a utility account of
Hmm.
theoretical education, which is just that when you, and I've talked about it already, that when you tell people stuff, you hope that it'll change the way they see the world, and you hope that that change will help them to live in the world better.
Mm.
In a
Could you clarify what you mean by live in the world better?
Yeah,
Specifically the word better.
to be well, it's more to be able to do what you want to be able to do more effectively. One of the things that I use is Huxley. I was trying to remember the author he was related to. Yeah. So he talks about, if you want to play chess, you're going to play it much better if you know the rules. And life is analogous to that. There are certain rules. I mean, he was a scientist. He was advocating for science to be taught in schools, which it wasn't at the time. But there are rules, there are laws of nature. And if you want to play the game of life, you're going to survive a little better if you know the laws of nature. I think that's quite, I mean, to me, that just makes sense. Like if you want to, dress appropriately for the weather, have a weather forecast. You're going to have a little bit of a better day. So being told what the weather's going to be like is going to help you to have a little bit of a better day.
Is the utility account only an account about what makes theoretical education good?
Only an account of theoretical education, yeah.
Okay. And so it might be the case that your full picture of the value of education is going to include things that push against the utility account value. Am I understanding that? Okay.
Yeah.
So and I'll just walk through what I'm thinking. You can tell me if this is right. A psychopath with a great education might be able to very effectively do many horrific things in the world. Such a person might be enabled by a theoretical education modeled on the utility account of education in order like to pursue those things much more effectively. And it might be the part of other parts of the educational day that rein that in. Maybe they need to have some moral and civic education that prevents Caligula from acting on things that are wrong, even though the utility producing parts. I'm using utility in your sense, not in the sense of utilitarianism. Even though those parts would make him better at producing those ends. Am I tracking?
Yeah, that's right. So, and one of my motivations was I wanted to give an almost politically neutral account of why we should teach philosophy in schools. Partially
Okay.
because I don't think that our current government and I are ever going to agree politically on,
Sure.
or at least, on what it is that the ultimate, or yeah. And also, I don't know, when I started the project, my supervisor said, well, all of philosophy of education is about ethics. And I thought, well, I want to try and make an argument that doesn't rest on something contentious. I think our ethical dimensions about education are very contentious and aren't going to appeal to everyone. And that was a motivation. I think as I've moved further into my career, I've become more confident in dealing with more political and ethical points of view. And so that is something that I'm really interested in, is that next question of, okay, well, this is why theoretical education might be valuable. How does that sit with other things of value that education has to offer? So I think there's lots of interesting questions like that about that balance, but which I don't deal with in the book at all. The book is completely neutral about, or as neutral as I could make it.
Sure.
For some reason, that was the direction I wanted to take. Yeah, it's not a book about the good life. You can have any conception of the good life and still think that theoretical education is valuable for the reason that I talk about, and that philosophy should be part of it.
That's really interesting. Let me see if I could
find a counterexample.
Well, I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
So when I read your book, what I was thinking of were cases like the ideally coherent Caligula, or not even the ideally coherent Caligula. I'm just talking about your average business student. I can imagine educational environments where providing somebody with a theoretical education that allows them to pursue whatever it is they want to do makes them lead a worse life, even by their own lights, because they're not being provided these other things that force them to consider what they ought to value and how they ought to live. And if they're being given a theoretical education within an environment where they're being given misinformation of what will make their lives go well, and here I'm thinking about the typical business student, um, then I could imagine that certain aspects of a theoretical education could make their lives go much worse. So those are the kinds of cases that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so that's an interesting subtlety, right? So if you have a broad theoretical education that is, the aim of that broad theoretical education is to help you to interact effectively with the world. One of
Yeah.
the aspects of the world that you have to interact effectively with is coming up with an idea of the good life for yourself. So
Mm.
the broad theoretical education, and this is one of the arguments for teaching philosophy, ought also to cover questions about how you should live. It seems bizarre to cover questions about how plants work and not to cover questions about the sort of life you should lead. And so that is also part of a theoretical education, right? To say, look, you can look at it this way. You know, such and such a philosopher looked at it this way, such and such looked at it that way. You could look at it this way. How do you think you should look at it? That is also telling people stuff. So within a theoretical education, the theoretical education is about giving you the stuff you need, the information you need to live your life as effectively as possible. Is going to involve looking at theories about what it means to live a good life. So
Mm.
it's kind of complicated.
No, that's a really good answer. So what you're saying is, I'm actually I'm actually being a little bit there's some sleight of hand going on in my question, because really what I'm saying to you is, well, couldn't a really bad theoretical education that leaves out information about the good life lead to people not pursuing the good life? And your answer is, well, yes, of course it could. But part of my kind of theoretical education is that it includes information from philosophy about the good life. And this is one of the justifications for philosophy.
Yeah, and the
Is that
nice thing
fair?
about
Yeah.
putting it that way is you can say, well, you have a critique of how theoretical education currently looks. A lot of it is bad. It
Yeah.
leaves out questions about the good life. I do think it needs to be supplemented, though. I do think that just having a theoretical understanding, having all of the history of thought on these ideas, even if you had time for that in the curriculum, um, could still lead to these skewed, over reasoned ways forward. I think I know that like a very uh, typical example is, for example, Ted Bundy, who argued himself into like drastic moral relativism and said, well, whatever. Yeah, and it was very well reasoned and argued, and there was a conclusion, and it was horrific. So that could still happen. I think the supplement that would be needed would be like living with people. So activities that get you involved with communities, with other people that that let you try out ideas in life and build empathy and all of those things that community and society and family should provide, but actually don't, and schools need to step up to. So I think probably that would be another side of schooling that I think ought to be there.
When we're thinking about your positive account,
Mm.
when we think about like what you think philosophy provides in terms of a unique value, one thing you talked about was its ability to talk about the good life and tell us how to live. But when we think about, but there's other things you mentioned too.
Okay, yeah. So there are two arguments, and the first one is what I've already talked a little bit about, that there are just areas of life that fall out, and we were talking about it just now, that fall outside of other disciplines, that there aren't clear answers to, that philosophers have traditionally studied. And so there's philosophical content that can help us to see those areas of life more clearly and to act more effectively in those areas of life. And obviously, the answers aren't clear, the answers aren't um, certain, and they're not comprehensive. But there's as much as you're going to get from anywhere, you can get from philosophical content. So that's one argument. I couch that in terms of like ordinary concepts, but that's not really important to understand what I mean. The other argument is the one I think that motivated me from the beginning, and that's much harder to put into words and to appeal to. And this is why I need that whole account of theoretical education. And it's this idea that if what you're trying to do by teaching children stuff, lots of different stuff in lots of different from lots of different disciplines, is to help them to interact effectively with the world, then you need to do something more than just put them in different classrooms and tell them these things and hope that they'll figure it out for themselves. That because of the way that we present information, and I think it's almost I don't know, I think it's probably necessarily this way, that our theories about the world have been developed within disciplines that have their own language, their own ways of conducting inquiry. And when you're at school, you were kind of taught in that way as well. And it makes sense that you're taught in that way because that's the most efficient way to teach theories about particular parts of the world. So the biology, history, maths. I don't really know what questions maths is addressing. Maybe some. I don't know. I'm not sure. That's a tricky one. Languages are also a tricky one. I'm not sure that's theoretical education. Learning how to read and write, not really sure. But literature, that's presenting ways of looking at the world, presented through that particular discipline. So anyway, we're going from subject to subject to subject, being given these different ways of thinking about the world. And that's it. And I think because these different subjects have different ways of talking about problems, have different ways of conceptualizing life, but in fact, we're hoping that altogether you'll be able to use all of these things to act effectively in your own life. There's a fragmentation, I call it problem of fragmentation, that's been referred to by P4C theorists, by other educational philosophers, who have pointed out that, well, what do you do with all of that stuff? How do you make sense of the world given this fragmented picture of lots of different theories that we're given about it? Surely at some point you've got to sit down and piece it all together. And again, if you look at who deals with that kind of question, it seems that philosophers have dealt with that kind of question. Sometimes they do a synthetic task of drawing on different ideas and trying to piece them together into an answer, doing their best to balance what those different theories that they're working with are trying to achieve, whether they're relevant to the question at hand, and how to go forward with it. So the best I can do here to back up that argument is to give examples of philosophers who've thought about their work in that way, and to hope that other people are on board. I think the value of that argument, even though it's in some ways relying on something a little shaky, which is just the idea that philosophers have traditionally seen themselves as doing this, is that if philosophy can help with that, then that is absolutely fundamental to what theoretical education is for, and that without it, there's no point. The theoretical education is not necessarily going to meet the aims that I think it is most legitimate in holding.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we go through the world with fragmentation. We learn all these different pieces of information, and we need some way of integrating it into a coherent answer to the question, what should I do about it? And philosophy helps us reduce fragmentation in that way. Is that fair?
Yeah, that seems like that's one of the things that philosophers do.
Two things that occurred to me when I was digesting this section of your book is that there might be other traditions that also give us some sort of synthesis. I'm thinking about like feminist theory, also a lot of religious traditions. So you might go and study the Talmud and kind of learn a coherent picture for putting things together. And the other thing I was thinking was that philosophical theoretical education could lead to more fragmentation. And I'm thinking about a student who studies all these different ethical theories and comes away thinking like, well, what do I do now? Like I used to have this coherent picture of how to put things together, but I don't know if I should be listening to Immanuel Kant's interpretation of his theory or, in my opinion, Christine Korsgaard's more correct version of Kantian ethics, or whether I should be whether Mill was right.
So I think an important point is that the aim shouldn't be to solve fragmentation, because what you want to avoid in a way are comprehensive worldviews. You don't want, you could be saying, well, okay, Marx has a lot to say about this. He has a comprehensive worldview. Just be a Marxist. Or religion has a comprehensive worldview of this, or such and such a YouTuber has a comprehensive conspiracy theory view of this. Very comprehensive, no fragmentation at all, right? Really smooth. and that doesn't seem to be something that will help people to live in light of what they know in the most effective way. Unless that sort of certainty has some sort of value. Maybe it does. I think more what we should be trying to achieve is to give people tools to deal with the fragmentation. So it is in fact true that philosophical theories are also fragmented from one another, but there's this dual side of philosophy, right? It presents you with the theories, but also presents you with the tools for how to figure out which of those theories have a slight edge over the other ones. And so it's that combination, I think, that when you turn to philosophy to look at this fragmentation, you'll not only get different theories about how to put the fragmentation together, but you'll get a systematic study of what to do with those different theories and how to balance them against one another. And I think that's why if Marxism was taught as one of those, as within a philosophy course, it would also be taught as like, here's one answer, okay, here's another answer, here's another. And now let's think about how, as philosophers, we deal with these different answers, how we make progress. And I think that's why turning to a discipline is important, because that's what disciplines do, right? So they have questions and they have theories and they have their own ways of making progress on those theories. And if you think about what philosophy has to offer when it comes to fragmentation, it has theories about how to deal with the fragmentation, sometimes fragmented theories, fragmented in terms of which questions it's asking about, fragmented in terms of the different answers. But like any discipline, it also has tools for making progress on that fragmentation. So I think that's a positive. I think it's some content and some tools. If we just gave comprehensive worldviews, that's one way of answering it, but it doesn't seem good.
Suppose you have a student come into a classroom and they really want a simplistic worldview, and that student is never going to face the negative consequence of not having a simplistic worldview, because really what they care about is these practical pursuits, and they know that they'll be able to get workable answers from this worldview. The utility account of education wouldn't justify imposing more challenging approaches to fragmentation than the simplistic one. Am I right about that?
I'm not sure. So I think that, I've had students say, well, why do I need to know this? I'm never going to leave this town. And I've thought, well, how are you going to ensure that you're never going to leave this town? First of all, it's a question whether you should ever leave this town. And the town in question, yes, they should have left that town. But the other question is how, that's a lot. If you do want to just stay in that town, you've got to have a lot of luck on your side. So if you do think that you can live a life where you're not going to run into things that genuinely challenge you, you might be right, but you were also relying on a lot of luck. And when we educate people, I think we try and give them what they need to face things that they might not know that they're going to need to face. That's the sort of paternal side of it, right? Where you're the older person, you have more experience, you've had more view of the world, you've read more, you have a bit more of an idea of what they might need. And at the point of children, I think if a child says, well, I'm going to be fine just taking this very simplistic view, I don't want to deal with these questions, they might be right. They might be right that they don't need to deal with those questions. But they might also be wrong, and if they're wrong, it would be a shame if no one had made an attempt to give them the tools that might be able to help them. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Makes sense. I think it does. So what you're saying is that a student might tell us, I really want this simplistic worldview. When I think about fragmentation, here's how I want to deal with it. And if a student tells us that, we could be paternalistic, even under the utility account of including things on the curriculum, And we could say, well, actually, your own aims aren't going to be best pursued by us giving you the education you're saying that you want. What we need to do is give you an education that we think is going to allow you to effectively deal with the world that you might find yourself in. And so we're going to give you philosophies, solutions, or not solutions, but philosophies, approaches, and tools for reckoning with fragmentation. Is that fair?
Yeah, and that's consistent with the reasons why we give any sort of theoretical education. Why do I tell you about
Yeah,
World
that's
War
right.
II? Well, yeah, you hopefully won't live through anything like World War II, but if you do, you should probably know this stuff.
Yeah,
Why should I know about plants and photosynthesis? Well, maybe you never have to deal with a plant, but maybe you do. And if you do, if you are going to deal
sure.
with plants, kind of likely you might have to deal. I mean, maybe you'll really have to deal with plants. Maybe it'll be World War II and you'll have to dig up your garden and plant plants. Then it'd be really good if you knew this stuff. So
Okay,
yeah,
got it.
so I like that consistency. I like that consistency between the the factual stuff, the theoretical stuff, the more humanitiesy stuff, the philosophical stuff. That there's this
Hmm.
one story about why it's there, and it's you. This might be really helpful to you.
Right, right.
Hopefully, it won't be.
Okay, good.
Hopefully, you can live your life however you want to live it without thinking about anything. But
Yeah,
realistically, the theoretical content is there for good reason.
right. And I think that what somebody who's more of a proponent of these intrinsic value accounts of educational goods might say is, um, even if somebody does end up living a life where they never have to deal with these complicated value questions, they're missing something. There's a certain level of richness that their life lacks, and their life is worse as a result. On the utility account, you're not able to say quite that, but what you're able to say is your life is probably going to deal with this. Like it's probably going to involve situations where you're going to need to reflect in this way. And even if your life doesn't, like we need to come up with an educational curriculum that works broadly for a lot of students and a lot of your peers as well. And so that might be not really a difference in terms of what will be prescribed, depending on what the account of intrinsic goods are, that the intrinsic value account does. But it's a different story. And in this bizarre theoretical world where somebody never encounters the problems of philosophy, they'll give different answers. But that's not the world we're engaging in.
Yeah,
Is
and
that fair?
yeah, and
Yeah.
I like that way around because there's a kind of there's a kind of higher goods issue with the intrinsic account, right? Where it's like, well, you're just a snob. You just think knowledge is better
Hmm.
than these other things, and lots of people don't
Right.
aren't very interested in theoretical content. They're just not, and that doesn't seem to be something that I want to argue with them about. Like, you should be interested. You're a bad person for not being interested. Um,
Uh huh.
so I think, or you should value this intrinsically. That feels to me wrong. I would prefer to avoid that, and so I think it's a nicer
Yeah.
answer to say, well, it's not that there's something wrong with you. You're not deficient because you don't value knowledge intrinsically. It's that the the theoretical content, the knowledge, is useful. And the other thing that's good about that way around is that when you get an intrinsic
Hmm.
value account of um, knowledge or of theoretical content, it tells you to just put in a bit of everything so that people have enough knowledge to access all the other knowledge. Um, I
Hmm.
suppose that would be the way around of doing it. If you say, well, actually, the theoretical content is there because it's useful, then you have a sort of way, a principle for thinking about what theoretical content you should include. And that's to start with, well, in the broadest sense, what is it that you're probably going to need to know? Which questions
Yeah.
are probably going to come up? And how do we cover that in the most efficient way? And that's not
Yeah.
that ends up not being a piecemeal. Okay, you need training how to do a mortgage. You need training how to um, make a bank account. You need training how to do this job you're going to do, because
Yeah.
that's not the most efficient way to cover all the different possibilities you might have in life. Right, that you just have to cover a huge encyclopedic amount of stuff. Um, but it's more about thinking about broadly. Okay, there's going to be kinds of questions about the good life, so we should address those. There's going to be questions about what you eat and how to be healthy. We're going to try and address those somewhere.
Sure.
And I think it ends up coming out a bit like school subjects already are, but with a more justified approach to why each piece of the school subject is there and what it's trying to achieve in the long run. And
Yeah,
whether
good.
people use that or don't use it, or whether it's useful to them in the end, is kind of depends on their life course. But I think there is some sort of duty to use at least some of the time that children spend in school trying to help them with their lives and in this way. And so I do think there is some role for theoretical education. I'm still curious about how big that role is, but yeah.
This is great. Yeah. So I think that you and I are both frustrated by the same people. I think you and I are both frustrated by people who say, oh, I can't tell you why this thing's valuable. I'm just going to claim that it's intrinsically valuable. And it's like, done. Or I'm just going to assert that it's a brute fact that this thing is wrong.
Yeah.
That's no fun.
No, it's a lazy argument.
It just seems lazy.
Yeah. And you see it a lot, unfortunately, in arguments about education. And you when you're a teacher, you hear it a lot from your colleagues about why their subject is more important than yours. Or we couldn't possibly not have this. Like, okay, well, I feel the same, but we should probably talk about it rather than just have a fight.
Yeah. Good. So your critique is of people of lazy, very silly people who make arguments like that, which is a lot of our colleagues in the field. I think that like underneath all this, though, I'm wondering if there is some kind of like an account of intrinsic value, maybe not like fully articulated, but somewhere in the background of the way that you're thinking about this, because you're thinking about the utility account of education as the justification for theoretical education, but that there's all these other things that we do that are other parts of the curriculum, and perhaps those things aim at well-being. And so preparing people for agency, preparing people to be able to act on, like, in accordance with their interests, is a really important part of what we're doing. But there could be other things that we're also trying to do that bring about other parts of flourishing or well-being. And so taken together, that might be this unified account. Either it's flourishing that generates the utility thing that you're pushing for, as well as generating other things, or it's some components of flourishing on the same level of analysis as the utility stuff. Is that right?
Yeah. So in my PhD thesis, which is what the book is based on, there is a section about how this utility account fits with like a bigger goal of flourishing. So because I do, although I wanted to keep out things that might be considered contentious, I think less and less people find well-being or flourishing contentious as an aim of education. It seems strange to find that contentious, but I think it's still settling a bit. I think it is settling around something like flourishing or well-being as being something that we can use as this compass point for what education should aim towards. And I think that that theoretical content is probably necessary. Some amount of theoretical content is necessary to facilitate flourishing. So I think it's a sort of basic good in that way. So I think you can easily fit it in. It would be nice to be in a position to do that work, to fit it in. I think I've spoken all along about these kind of questions that I have about the role of theoretical education, and that I'm still interested in pursuing that. So I think that's kind of the direction that I'd go with that.
Well, that's exciting. Well, the last thing I was going to ask you is about your plans for future research, but I think you just answered that.
Yeah.
That's the so I have to say, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
In this book. Okay. You want to talk about other? Yeah.
No,
what else
I don't
are you?
Want to. No.
You have other things. You don't want to? Okay. Excellent. Well, I've really enjoyed this. This has been fantastic. When I originally read your book, I had a couple of like thoughts. One of them was that Jane seems like a fellow traveler. I need to meet her and talk to her because I love her critiques of the sorts of creatures that I'm also critical of, sorts of arguments. I also love the use of analytic philosophy to give answers to these ordinary concept questions and also to help with fragmentation. I also just love the analytical rigor. And I think this interview has made me see even more closely how, just how much I like your approach to thinking about these questions.
No, I mean it's nice to. It's really nice. I also really enjoyed the conversation, and I think you have a lot of things that have been unsaid that I'm also curious about. So look forward to reading your book.
Oh, I had to write one first. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, thank
write a
you.
book for me, please.
Thank you so much. I will. I'll dedicate it to you.
Yay.
Now I actually have to do it 'cause I'm putting this in an interview.
Yeah.
All right.
You
Well,
can edit it
have a
out, right?
good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
I could, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
You don't have
I
to
feel like
commit
it'd be
to that.
funnier if I not.